Okay, in this chapter, we're going to talk about economic growth. Let me quickly summarize what we have discussed in previous lecture. So in previous lecture, we focused on the measurement of GDP. We focused on measurement of price index, right? So there we also differentiate between nominal GDP and real GDP. But at the end of the day, so what really matters to us is real GDP, because real GDP is going to tell you the actual standard of living. But certainly it's only in the average, right? Because so in order to have a bigger picture or more complete picture regarding to the well-being of the society, we need to look at other measures. So this comes up later. But now let's look at economic growth. And in this chapter, we are going to study the following things. Number one, we are going to study why we look at real GDP per capita, why this is a good measure for long-run economic growth. And then number two, we're going to study what is behind long-run economic growth. All right, so this is a bullet point 2 and 3. What are the factors? And then, so we are going to explain the difference in terms of growth experience across country. And even for one country, so their difference may, even for one country over time, their growth experience may differ. We need to understand what's behind those differences. Right? And finally, we are going to touch on the concept of sustainability. So this is related to climate change, related to resources use. So those usually was required to provide the economic growth, right? But certainly there's some negative consequence. Right? But for now, let's just focus on growth at the beginning, right? So these slides highlight the importance of studying growth, but growth, they brings your prosperity or brings your benefit, and you should also come with some cost, like this background picture shows. So China is considering a fast-growing country. So their growth experience was significant, was fantastic during the past 3 or 4 decades. Okay? But this comes with high cost, which is pollution. But certainly there are other costs associated with economic growth. Okay? Now, these pictures just tell you how different countries are going to behave or perform over time. And this actually just tells us the importance of economic growth. Here we have data from 1900 to 2010, and we look at 3 countries. And for each country, we look at real GDP per capita, and we are trying to convert into a same currency, which is US dollar. Okay. On the horizontal line is time, on the vertical line is real GDP per capita. And this is in 1990 dollar. So, or in other words, we use 1990 as a base year, right? Another thing I want to highlight is that in the vertical line, we use log scale. Log scale has 2 benefits. Number one, if the number just change dramatically with log scale, so it's easier to put in a graph to see. Okay, you kind of rescale the graph. This is number one benefit. Number 2 benefit of log scale is that so the slope of the curve at each point is going to tell you the growth rate. That's just from simple calculus. Or in other words, to be precise, if you look at this part, this is for United States, the slope is going to immediately tell you what is the growth rate of per capita GDP, right? Now let's look at these 3 countries, and based on this diagram, okay, there's a couple of things we should immediately notice. Number one, for these 3 countries, over time, there's an increase in per capita GDP overall, right? Yes, there's periods went down, but overall there was increasing. This is number one. Number 2, so there's a significant gap between US and the rest of the other country, right? So there's a huge gap, and this gap was persistent. Number 2. Now, number 3, so if I ask you comparing China and the US for time period after 1980, what do you notice? The gap is getting smaller and smaller. Or in other words, China is playing a catching up, right? But then, so what does this catching up means, and what is the source of this catching up? So this catching up means they are growing faster. Remember, as I just mentioned earlier, for log scale, so the slope is the growth rate. And then so here, so the slope, so in order to close the gap, it must be the case. So your slope is going to steeper, right? Just if you're parallel, it means you're never going to catch up, right? Are you with me? Okay, so it must be the case your slope is going to steeper compared to the other one. But then your slope is the growth rate. Steeper your curve, meaning the higher the growth rate. Then to summarize, the closing gap coming from different growth rate. Right? Now with those observations, and then this comes with a few questions. So that's what we are trying to understand or trying to answer in this lecture. Question number one, what explains the difference or the gap between US and the rest of the world? Or in this case, the difference, the gap between US and China or India is number one. Number two, what is behind the catch-up of China? This is number two. And number three, so why China managed to experience a catch-up, but not India? And then why this catch-up only happens after 1980? Will this catch-up sustainable? Okay, so those are questions we are trying to answer in this lecture. But overall, so the main theme is what is behind economic growth. There are different experiences in terms of growth, like this picture clearly shows. Comparing country, the growth experience different. Same country, different time period, growth experience different. But there's more deep question we need to understand. So why we care about economic growth? The reason why we care about economic growth, I think is very obvious. If you look at the United States, and over time, you can see, so we are just move up on this scale. But then this scale is kind of tells us, or is a proxy for standard living. Everyone wants to have a better life. Average American want to have a better life. And over time, so we did achieve that. So that's why we care about economic growth. On the other hand, so you're comparing China versus US or India versus US. So they want to have a better life. They made progress, they're closing the gap. Right? So this is another reason or another dimension to explain to you why growth or why the understanding of economic growth is important. Okay. Now, before we show you further concept, let's look at these examples. So this example help us understand why we focus on per capita real GDP, but not the total GDP. Okay, read this question. Suppose Micronesia, this is a hypothetical country. Its real GDP is 200 million in 2010. And suppose the population is 100,000 in 2010 and 105 in 2011. At the same time, GDP grow by 5%. Now, this question asks you, what is going to be the real GDP per capita in Micronesia in 2011? Total GDP grew by 5%. Population grew by what percentage? 5%. Now in per capita term, what happened? These two cancel each other. Hence, what happened in per capita term? Nothing happened, right? So that's why we look at real GDP per capita. Well, in other words, if you look at individual, on average, nothing changed in terms of standard living. If you look at the total size, yes, the economy is doing well, right? But that's kind of illusion. This is similar to look at nominal GDP versus real GDP, right? So we settled with real GDP per capita because that just tells us how we are doing on average in per person term. Okay. Right, so we have two more slides, kind of just summarize or kind of emphasize the value of looking at economic growth. So here, this slide just look at US. This is just put the graph we saw earlier in table, right? So how we read this graph? How we read this table? In this table, we look at time period from 1900 to 2010. And in this column, we look at the real GDP per capita. And we standardize, we normalize 1900 equal to 100%. And everything is in terms of 1900. Now, if you look at 2010, so our real GDP per capita grow eightfold, almost eightfold. The other way to look at that is if we just keep this as 100, meaning it's 100 years ago or 110 years ago, the standard living is merely 10%, roughly, a little bit more than 10% compared with today. Right, so this was achieved in a century. But what is behind this change? This is what we call economic growth. Okay, roughly speaking, there are eightfold increase in standard living. Okay, so this is what happened. But where this coming from? Coming from growth, right? Now, the other way to look at this, just look at the current world. Okay, just we look at different country. So this is a world map, and then so we use different color and particularly different yeah, right. So density, not density. I don't know what to say. Anyway, so the darker the color, like here, so we use this dark or this yes, this dark purple to represent high income, which has more than $12,276 per person or more. This is classified as high income. And to you, this probably is not considered as high income. But it's worldwide, this is how we classify as high income. On the other hand, so you have lots of countries who has very low income. And here low income is defined as less than $1,045 per year per person. So just roughly says for them per day, they have less than $3 to spend, right? So clearly you can see there is a wide range of difference across country. There are countries are very rich, but the country are very poor. But then again, so that just linked to the earlier question I asked. What explains their difference? So in some sense, so these slides and these slides, we look at two different dimensions. So this world map look at a given time period, but across country. And this one, we look at one country, but over time. One is through the lens of, through the dimension of time. The other is through the dimension of geography. But clearly you can see in either dimension, so there's a change in economic performance or change in growth. But then, so what is behind the change or what's behind the difference? That's what we are trying to understand or trying to study in this lecture. Now here I'm going to introduce a rule of 70. What is rule of 70? The rule of 70 says if you grow, if you have a growth rate, and then you're going to double your income, whatever. Okay, so this can be income, or it can be your height, or it can be your weight, or it can be your profit, anything. Okay, so you're going to double in 70 divided by your growth rate. Here's an example. So if real GDP per capita grow by 3.5% per year, it's going to take 70 divided by 3.5, which is equal to 20 years to double your real GDP per capita. How we come up with this rule of 70? So this is coming from the following equation. Okay. So the original equation is the follows. You need to have 1 plus x raised to the power of n equal to 2. What is x? X is the growth rate. What is n? N is the number of years to double. How many years to take to double your either your income or whatever you are interested in. Right? And then so for students who has strong calculus background, okay, and then so you can take a log and then you take the approximation. But this is not required for this class. So here I just give you the mathematics behind this rule of 70. Right? For us, if you understand this rule of 70, that's good enough. So summarize, grow by x is going to take 70 divided by x years to double. So that's rule of 70. That's all we need to know. Okay. Now let's look at 2 examples to understand this rule of 70. Example number 1. Suppose real GDP per capita grow at 2% per year. How many years will it take to approximately double? Use rule of 70 is going to be 70 divided by 2. Okay, the answer is C, right? Okay, now we have another example. This example a little bit more involved. To save your time, let me just highlight the information. We compare 2 countries, India versus Italy. Indian current GDP per capita 3,000. Italy is 24,000. Indian grow at 5% per year. This question asks you how many years it takes for India grow from 3,000 to 24. So we need to do the following step. First, from 3,000 to 24. So you increase by how many fold? 8. Right. Number 2, for India, how many years did it take to double? 70 divided by 5%, which is equal to 14 years. Now, number 3, to grow by 8 fourths, how many times do you need to double? How many times you need to double so that you can increase 8-fold? 3 times. 2 times 2 times 2 equal to 8. So you need to double 3 times. The number 4, how many years take to increase by 8-fold? 14 times 3, right? Because every 14 years, you double. The first 14 years, you double. The second 14 years, you're going to become quadruple. And then after the third 14 years, it becomes eightfold. 14 times 3. So that's how we write down. So that's how we solve this problem. Okay. Now this one is kind of summarize or kind of reinforce the discussion we had. So we cannot take growth as for granted. There's the difference, the growth experience across country. Right. So United States is in the middle. And China is here, it's pretty high. And then, so in the far right, you have Zimbabwe, not catching up, not growing, they're getting worse and worse. You're wondering what happened, what make them become worse and worse. What do you think? What can be the possible explanation? Largely because of war destruction. So the economy is shrinking, right? Here, so US 1.7%, but first of all, we cannot underestimate this number. Second of all, we cannot take this for granted. In history, not many countries can achieve this for a century. So this is what the United States did. But now let's just use a rule of 70 to understand what this 1.7 means. First, approximately take how many years to double income for United States with a growth rate of 1.7. 41, is it? Okay, around 40, right? Yeah, 41. So then in 1 century, roughly how many times we can double? 2.5 or around like 3. So that's how we end up with, in the earlier slide, we saw the number around 7.8 times, right? Remember, again, I want to emphasize very few countries, maybe 1 or 2 countries, manage to do that over a century. If you can persistently doing this for a century, then you are going to become a powerful country. This is number 1. Number 2, so now if you compare these 2 countries, now you'll realize the high growth, the power of high growth. Like we just said, in 1 century, US can roughly grow by between 7 to 8 fold. Now what this means, if you have a growth rate like this, so basically they can achieve that in 3 decades or even less. But then, so the issue is whether they can sustain this, right? To summarize, small number translate into huge difference, number 1. Number 2, so you need to persistently doing this, right? Okay, so now let's keep this. Now let's look at the source of long-run growth. Oh, by the way, to summarize what we have discussed so far, through example, through data, so we realize over time, so there's a growth, there exists difference in growth experience, and across country there also exists difference in growth experience. Now we need to understand what is behind those things. But first, what is economic growth? And what's the best measure for economic growth? The best measure is labor productivity. But what is labor productivity? Labor productivity essentially is output per worker, or how much each worker can produce. How much we can produce eventually is going to translate into how much income we have, how much we can consume. And so that's why we end up with this indicator, labor productivity. But then, so what determines labor productivity? What do you think matters to how much each worker can produce? The answer to that question is going to relate to earlier concept we talked about, production function. Yes, you have something to say. So what matters? I'm asking, yeah. So what matters to labor productivity? What factor determine labor productivity? What do you think? One would be capital. What else? What else do you think matters to labor productivity? Like each worker, how much they can produce? He mentioned the capital is working condition. Yes, I think working condition, it should be classified or can be interpreted as capital, right? Like say for example, you have a building, right? And then if you work in the field, you have production skills, you have machines help you. So that should classify or interpret it as capital. What else you think is important? I'm sorry?
Pay.
Hey, it is important, but that's a reflection to, in some sense, pay is a reflection to your productivity. You're right? It's pay, right? Okay, so let me tell you, okay, so it probably is a little bit hard. So they mentioned the first important thing, which is physical capital. And then the other factor matters is human capital. What is human capital? Like the skill, knowledge you have. And furthermore, we need the technology. Now let's go one by one, okay? Start with physical capital. Okay? Just imagine, now we in Nebraska, right? So one of our main economy is agriculture. Just imagine without any help or without much help from machines, how much acres of land a prime age male can manage? What do you think? A few, like probably 2 or 3 acres, right? So this is a number came out from an earlier session. Just give you an idea. As I have a small garden. I mean, physically, I only manage to. I mean, my physical limit is managed like 10 square meter. So that's pretty much I can manage, right? So in a prime age male, without help of a machine, you can manage very little field, right? But now, if you have a tractor, how many acres of land you can manage? It's going to usually you're going to manage hundreds, right? So this example tell you the importance of physical capital. Okay. Now, second factor, human capital. What is human capital? Essentially is education and knowledge embodied in your experience. Okay, use the example I just gave to you. Just think about farmer. Okay, so this farmer has a tractor. If this farmer doesn't read, what is the value of this tractor? It's going to be very limited, right? Or in other words, this farmer may not know how to operate this machine properly. It's not going to release all the potential of this machine. So this is the value of human capital. Now, the third one is technology progress. What is technology? So these days we talk about ChatGPT. So that's a perfect example of technology, right? So with ChatGPT, you can do many things. To give example, I have a friend, I was on the phone with him over the weekend, and he's a professor at WashU, which is Washington University in St. Louis. And he told me he has a subscription of ChatGPT. I asked him what he does with ChatGPT, and he told me he used ChatGPT to prepare his lecture notes. And he used ChatGPT to do lots of administrative work. Like, for example, he need to write a report, and then so he throw a question to ChatGPT. ChatGPT giving him the answer, and then he do copy and paste. So this gives example how technology changed how we work, save a lot of his time, and then so he can do other things. Like, so those are the factors that are important. And then in the next step, we are going to put this factor in this production function. But that before I explain to you in this production function, I want to highlight one thing. Physical capital, human capital, usually we take those for granted, but this is not readily available for many people in other countries. Even in the United States, the significant of human capital, right? So one way to measure human capital is education. Even in the United States, if we look at history, not too far, a few decades ago, very few people has the privilege to get a high school degree. Today, so we just take for granted, average American is going to get a college degree, right? But a few decades ago, even the average American don't have the privilege to receive high school education. But we know what makes a difference, right? With high school degree and a high school diploma with a college degree, what kind of knowledge you have, right? Okay, let me stop here.